Well, welcome and thank you for being part of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. Together we are making climate action a central moral issue of the Jewish community. We came to organize this event after attending a presentation that predicted drastic changes in living conditions within a relatively short time and discovered that we were writing simultaneous blog posts about it. This session, however, is not predicated entirely on extreme change. Together, we're going to consider three scenarios based on different timeframes and different degrees of change. Our focus is on possible Jewish responses to the situation and to possible changes. The title refers to the village of Yavneh, where after the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai led the creation of a new expression of Judaism, one suited to new conditions of life. Our premise is that Judaism can and will adapt. Today we're going to discuss how. Our sponsors are the two organizations with which we're affiliated, the Jewish Center and Federation of the Twin Tiers, where I'm the executive director, and Congregation Kol Ami, where Malachi is a rabbinic intern. Both of these organizations are located in Elmira, New York, which is on the ancestral land of the Seneca people, a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This is a favorite quotation of mine, and it really explains why we need to discuss what seems in some way to be a matter of science in a religious context. Gus Speth was one of the founders of the National Resource Defense Council. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. I hope that in a religious community, we have some ideas about how to bring that about, and we'll be sharing some today. Everybody will be sharing. We'd like to do introductions now, and I'll ask you to say your name, where you are, and if you wish, your roles in the Jewish community. We're not presuming that you have any formal role. You may be the Jew in the pew or the Jew who stays out of the pew and doesn't occupy a leadership position, and that's just fine. But if there's anything you want to tell us, that's great. But please limit it to about 25 words.
Right. I'm Oren Steinitz. I'm the rabbi in Congregation Kol Ami in Elmira and an adjunct professor at the Aleph ordination programs. And the closed captioning for this is hilarious.
Okay, Andrew, please.
You're muted, Andra.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Andrew Frank, Elmira, New York, past president of the Jewish Community Center and of Hadassah, board member of the Temple, very active in the sisterhood and in the Jewish community all the time I've lived here.
Thank you, Andra. Perhaps we'll just go down the list. Daniel, if you could.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I live in Western Massachusetts, town of Shutesbury, and I'm a member of the Jewish community.
Great.
Okay. Elliot, please.
Hi, I'm Elliot. I live in the Bronx, and I do play a role in the Jewish community. I work for Prisma, which is the organization that supports state schools. I'm not here as a representative, and I'm a environmental activist.
Thank you. Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Strassfeld. I'm the Rabbi Emeritus of the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, the Reconstructionist Synagogue in Manhattan.
Thank you. Ronit is unable to turn on the microphone, but is Ronit from Jerusalem involved in climate activism in Israel? And will be joining soon with video.
Excellent. Stuart?
I am Stuart. I'm from the southern tier of New York in Corning near Elmira. I've lived the Atlantic mid-coast, Pacific, South California, and in Israel. I'm more or less a secular Jew with a background in Reform Reconstructionist and a mishmash.
And I'm Vicki Mike, and I live in Corning, New York, and I am a recent member of Kol Ami. I recently converted to Judaism this past summer.
I think that was everybody. Thank you for all introducing yourselves. It looks like a fairly broad crowd here, and that's a good thing to have. Diversity is a powerful asset right now.
Circling back to why this is a religious question, this is something we learned from the Reverend Michael Dowd. He's a United Church of Christ minister who considers himself a climate change evangelical. Many Christians consider him a heretic, by the way. Anyhow, he describes religion as the control mechanism of stable or sustainable societies. It recognizes that all benefits and real wealth come from the living biosphere, which he thinks is inseparable from God. That God, or reality, if you will only continue to dispense these benefits and wealth if life's critical order, the essential integrity or way, is honored and preserved. And the fundamental role of religion, which he describes as life ways. I've pointed out to him that his theology is that of Reconstructionist Judaism, is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present, by fiercely preserving the integrity of the ecosphere and the critical order of the cosmos, which he identifies with the way. I asked him if he was aware that the literal Hebrew for that is halacha, and knew what that meant. And he said that I was not the first person to ask that.
Four laws of deep sustainability that we could take a look at here. Biocentric, not an anthropocentric measurement of progress and success. This is something recently that's I've found I like to describe as not perhaps assigning a monetary value to everything. We find ourselves dominated by economists who tell us that the world's global standing timber have a dollar value. Perhaps that's not the best way to view that. Prioritizing present over the future. A little less mysterious, but if we don't do something to ensure we have a place to land, what are we doing? Material limits are real. This is, again, coming back to economists and the idea that an economy can continuously grow through an unlimited timeline in a, let's say, directly proportional way. There is a fallacy there that we have to really begin to take to heart. And impacts for good or ill must be mirrored back. We exist in a relationship.
One of the significant aspects of that is the idea that the impact needs to be mirrored back to those who caused the impact and not displaced onto other people and other places.
Hmm. So from a uniquely Jewish perspective, something that I've continued to go to, we discussed this, is this section from Deuteronomy, which is also part of the Shema, something that is, or presumably designed to be reread and contemplated several times a day by the most traditional amongst us. If you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain in your land in its season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil, and I will also provide grass in the field for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill. Take care not to be lured away, and serve other gods and bow to them, for the Lord's anger will flare up against you. He will shut up the skies so there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is assigning you. Now, do I think this needs to be read literally? No, I don't. I don't want to espouse the idea of a deity that's hovering over our shoulders, waiting for us to make mistakes and punish us either. But this provides an interesting place for a lot of room that we can begin contemplating how our culture was handed to us and how we can hand on a sense of culture that can help engineer, if you will, a more sustainable future.
Okay, we're now going to go to our first discussion in breakout rooms. And for this one, what we want to do is identify one, two, or three factors, according to the time you have and what seems important to you. Factors in contemporary Jewish life that could be modified to mitigate climate change. Some topics you might consider are that Jewish life in America is built around large institutions which necessarily have large buildings. There's a lot of competition among those institutions, a lot of factionalization, and a lot of duplication. It's largely structured around centralization on urban centers, which means for everyone not in an urban center, Jewish life may require very long travel distances. The first time I joined a synagogue as an adult, I lived in rural Oregon. And it was only 45 or 50 miles for me to get to the synagogue, but for some people it was 200. Kashrut tends to drive waste in a couple of different ways. One of them is that institutional kashrut in particular seems to encourage the use of disposables. The second is that if you live in a place like Elmira, you may, and you are not vegetarian, you end up having kosher meat shipped to you from a long distance, which is inefficient. Hospitality can be a driver of waste. A few years ago, there was a television series called Wasted. It was an American spin-off of a New Zealand series, which is where that originated, that worked with one household to reduce the total amount of waste it produced, whether that was on energy, trash, transportation, you name it. And one of the households the American series did an episode with was an observant household where one issue was leaving all the lights in the house on for 25 hours on Shabbat. And another, though, was the tendency to prepare far too much food for Shabbat because the woman of the house never knew how many guests her husband might bring back from the synagogue. And they found solutions to all of those things, as well as to using disposables for all of that food. The one that strikes me as the biggest one in Jewish society as a whole is affluence, affluenza. We are, to some extent, a culture of ostentatious, not just conspicuous, but ostentatious consumption. And we also operate with the pernicious notion that all Jews are affluent, which is a real barrier to Jewish life for those who are not. And then the last one I want to bring up is anthropocentric theology. That's the belief that humans are the purpose of creation, or what we could call weak anthropocentrism or anthropoarchism, that humans are at the top of the heap and everything else exists for our benefit. Just if you want to know, there are people who read the Torah that way, and Maimonides says flat out, they're wrong.
The idea that we're in an existence that's other than organismic, that we are somehow a special piece of it all above the rest versus a component part of a system that is a whole. I'm going to dump our discussion questions into the chat window for everyone. I'm also going to paste in a link to the overall discussion components for you to open in a side window if you like, before we get into some breakout rooms and we have a chance to discuss these things together.
Looking at it that way, I think that we have to think about Judaism as a moral issue now, and not kashrut. And do you have anything to add, Malachi?
Well, and thank you for bringing that up for the group. And that, yeah, we were just wrapping up in a discussion of eco-kashrus and how it's maybe a place we can begin to be more flexible or more broadly in definition, finding ways to utilize that term to make a more sustainable future. So why don't we yield to the floor and move on?
Okay, Elliot, are you ready?
Sure, gladly. I was paired with Daniel. So I think we both came to this question from a similar place. I think we're both involved with getting, trying to get people aware and, getting people to practice some form of eco-kashrut and recycling and everything. But the main focus, I mean, we're in a situation of such urgency. We really don't have a lot of time, and we really need to go right to the center of our institutional life and make changes there. It's a matter of will. If people have the will, they're going to make these changes. They're going to care about them. But that requires a change of spiritual and intellectual consciousness of the urgency of the situation. So we really need to, in my view, focus on the federations as the main kind of center of gravity in our community, to make them care and aware and care about of the impact of climate change, and make them centers of education and planning how the Jewish community as a whole is going to make adaptations and work with other communities to do the work needed.
Excellent. Let's see. And if you were paired off with Daniel, I think that would put on my list Oren next, if you feel up to that, or your partner.
So we were paired off. I was paired off with Stuart and Vicky, and we only got to one suggestion. We talked about, Stuart mentioned of reintroducing the second paragraph of the Shema into liberal Jewish practice, and I shared a story by Rabbi Daniel Siegel and teaching that he wrote that if in the past Rabbi Arthur Green, when he was a rabbinical student at JTS, said that he reads this traditional paragraph justifying it by thinking if only it were so, right now Reb Daniel says, I'm reading it thinking if only it were not so. And Rabbi Daniel goes even further than what Paul said before about the anthropocentric perception of Judaism. Rabbi Daniel calls it flat out idolatry, claiming that the world was created to serve us, if we mean it in a literal sense, is absolute heresy, right? And now that we know that that there are consequences to our earthly consequences to our actions, that our previous generations in the Reformed Reconstructionist movements thought was a completely ridiculous and supernatural idea. Now we know that what maybe our ancestors were a little smarter than we gave them credit for. So bringing back this paragraph is a very small step we can take, and we did not even mention it, but I think that this also hints to a much bigger problem, is that for the vast majority of Jews, and I include even the ultra-Orthodox in this, Judaism is at best folklore and at worst a high society social club. And many Jews would have a very big problem recognizing that Judaism has anything valuable to say about the way they conduct their lives, which is a much bigger problem than this or that paragraph, or what we do in a particular institution.
Thank you, Rabbi.
A parallel to that, my experience as an educator, is that it is hard to teach about many things as Jewish moral issues, because to the students, the moral issue seems to be a secular one and so obvious as not to require discussion.
Yep.
That was.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Oh, that was the reason I brought this up, was I thought this audience, this set of participants, is already focused by just the fact that they're showing up here in this discussion, that they're already convinced of the validity of the proposition. And I was thinking that we should not forget the obvious action of education and moral encapsulation of an idea that we can say every time we have a service, so that rabbis and lay leaders can have a hook to talk about this in a recurring, simple, focused kind of way. We are already jumping to the what can we do? And one of the first things I think we need to remember to do is to bring others along.
Yeah.
Indeed. And that is coming up later in this session, by the way.
Very
okay. I think that some of the idea, the bad theology, the idolatrous belief that everything was created for us, probably comes from chapter 1 in Genesis, where it says, to fill the earth and subdue it, or master it, or dominate it, depending on the translation you use, and none of those is a really wonderful translation. But I mentioned that Maimonides says that the whole idea is wrong, and here's the actual passage. All the other things, too, have been intended for their own sakes and not for the sake of something else. For with reference to none of the things created is the statement made in any way that it exists for the sake of some other things. God only says that God brought every part of the world into existence and that it conformed to its purpose. This is the meaning of the saying, and God saw that it is good. About the whole, it says, and God saw everything that God had made, and behold, it is very good. A lot of people seem to conclude that very good refers to humans, but actually it's to the totality of the universe.
it's a matter of cultural engineering too, that our forebears came up with this schematic, and one could look back, and I've heard it argued well, that Israel is a land of difficult environmental constraints. We needed to have some sort of controls over ourselves if we were going to persist on a land that would not tolerate misuse, let's call it that. And the idea that we can build upon and add layers to this tradition is not, again, also unheard of. And I've been found saying such things as, when we conclude Pesach Seder, saying next year in Jerusalem, that perhaps that should be not so much an idea of a literal flight to a city, but that everywhere in the world should be so nice as Jerusalem. That everywhere in the world can be this this view that the Shema takes, that we need to take care of it, not just one land. We can expand these concepts. Were there some other groups that wanted to jump in here? Ranit, I think you must have been a breakout. Are you able to be on mic yet? Or your partner? Okay.
Okay. The next topic we're going to discuss is what we do, what we could do with resources that are more constrained than they are now. Up till now, we've been talking about things that clearly need to be done in the world as it is. Now we're looking ahead to a not so distant time when community life is still organized about the same way, but the resources available for Jewish life are limited. That could be voluntary or it could be involuntary. In particular, let's imagine that travel is difficult, expensive, or impossible. It won't be practical, let's say, for very many people to live in large suburban houses, both because of the environmental cost of the house itself in building and operating it, but also because of commuting distance and the cost of transportation. Especially, let's imagine that there's almost no air travel, and that means little or no travel to Israel. In education, everybody thinks that sending kids to Israel is the magic bullet that makes them identify as Jewish. Okay, before the 1950s, that was totally impossible in America. And we see some of the consequences of that, but I'm not sure that the outcomes are better now. But let's imagine that we need something other than Israel to sustain Jewish life. The idea of Israel, yes, spending much time there for most people, let's say probably not. And then the shipping of kosher food, of religious supplies, religious books becomes difficult, expensive, or just impossible. And what we've already spoken a little about, that institutional buildings, large institutional buildings in particular, become completely unaffordable or are just unobtainable to most Jewish organizations. So in this discussion, we're going to ask you to identify 1 to 3 aspects of contemporary Jewish life that could be modified in the foreseeable future in response to resource constraints, and be prepared to discuss one with the whole group.
I'm going to throw that link in one more time also, in case it got lost in the way. What I've just put in again was that request for this breakout room. We're working towards 3 aspects of contemporary Jewish life that could be modified. So here's that link again to all of our discussion topics in case you need it. And we'll break out and see how the conversations went again. Ranit's suggesting it may not be best to put into a breakout room. I could see how through chat that might be a struggle.
Since it's a pretty small group, anyhow, should we just stay in one room, maybe? I don't know. What do you think?
Let's go ahead with the breakout and make it shorter, okay? And I'll put 3 people to a room. Is that what I meant to do? Okay, this may not be what I was trying to do, but let's go ahead.
I'm going to make room 3.
To come to a live mic or a video. I'm glad you're with us yet.
Okay, so we were on only 2 groups, but the one I was in had a lot to say, and I'm going to guess that the other does as well. So let's share.
We were leaving off. I was in a group where we were leaving off with the idea of engineering our way forward, not just asking what can Judaism do for us, but what can we do for Judaism. And one of the things, as Paul mentioned, we were both writing on this topic that I ended up coming back to in my memory was culture engineering and the idea of how are we going to warn the future about radiological issues? Because we're a nuclear society building nuclear waste, and that stuff decays over eons. So how do we tell them? And a couple of scientists who were working on the problem had a little fringe thought, well, why don't we genetically engineer cats? We love cats, as pets. They'll be with us in 10,000 years. Why don't we genetically engineer a cat that will react, and we'll make songs and folk tales about these cats so that they stay in the collective consciousness long into the future, long past whatever language system shift has occurred. These ideas will still be with us. So that was called the Ray Cat idea. There is a catchy song on YouTube if you're into looking it up. But we have inherited a kind of cultural engineering, and Yavneh historically was a moment of cultural engineering. How do we forward what we call Judaism? So I think that's where we left our discussion.
Rabbi Oren referred to the Jewish catalog and its effect. You know, it was certainly formative for me, and I was actually in a community where there was a synagogue not far away at the time. The idea to teach people how to have Jewish lives without a Jewish institution, outside of a Jewish institution.
Yeah, not necessarily without one, but it doesn't have to. The Judaism does not have to happen only within the perimeters of a building.
Abdallah!
For instance. Mm-hmm.
You've done a great job with that with us.
Baby steps, yes.
Yeah, yes, Elliot, and I was sorry that he wasn't here to hear us say this.
Yes.
This is actually the second copy of the entire set that I've bought in my lifetime, because I have distributed copies of the Jewish catalog to groups of people I've lived with looking for how to continue doing this.
Maybe there should be a revised version. I don't know. I mean, there's.
I have the first one within
Yep.
you.
it went to the third Jewish catalog, and again, perhaps it's time for a fourth Jewish catalog.
Or the new Jewish catalog. The thing is, everything that's in the first one is still applicable.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is less true when you get to the third one. But yeah, I mentioned that when I moved here in 2007, there were at that time 2 synagogues, and they both functioned as if they were the only Jews in the world. It's not just that I mean they had nothing to do with each other, but as far as they knew, nobody was practicing Judaism anywhere else. Now that's in part because so many of the members had never been Jewish anywhere else. You know, there were a good many members who grew up in secular households and began learning Judaism when they enrolled their children in Hebrew school. And there were a good many Jews by choice, you know, whose total experience of Judaism was in this little town out in the middle of nowhere.
And many people that grew up here and their parents grew up here and never lived anywhere else.
Yes.
It was very insular.
Mhm.
And, you know, I think now the countervailing force is the internet. But I think if there is less travel and less moving about the country, less time in Israel, we could be heading that way again. You know, when I say the internet is the countervailing force, and one of the things that remains to be seen is whether all of the measures that were taken in response to the pandemic will remain. I belong to one of the organizations of the conservative movement, where I would say there's a strong feeling that they should not. You know, that internet minyanim are only allowed because of a health emergency, and as soon as there isn't one, they're going to stop holding them.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, our position has been that once you start, you can't stop.
Well, and we've discovered on our side that the use of an internet-based minyan has become one of an accessibility issue, and if we are living in dispersed regional areas, for myself, even though I am a member of my local Jewish community, our community isn't one that could support a daily minyan, and so I find mornings I'm met at a Manhattan synagogue online by many fine fellows, some of whom I didn't know I was connected to in ways until I found I needed this daily minyan with the loss of an uncle for the sake of Kaddish. Suddenly you find you have friends all over in the Jewish world when we break down these barriers of time and space and we can get online with each other. So that 500 miles is nothing now.
Indeed. And this brings us to our third discussion topic, which is the possibility of truly drastic change. I have to say, not necessarily in our lifetimes, but within a time that is possible to think about, where large areas of the world become almost uninhabitable. We'll see some migrations, voluntary, some not, probably to higher or cooler climates cooler, that will be only the temperature it is here now, let's say. We could see wars over territory, as you know, as Canada becomes more desirable than the southern United States. A reduction in industrial civilization and the realization that technology is not going to save us, and that everlasting growth and continuous progress are not going to. A question was raised in the chat about whether we should be talking about the role of multinational corporations and big money in destroying community for their own financial benefit. And I think that's actually a consideration. And if these kinds of changes take place, it's going to leave us in a much worse position. So for this discussion, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're part of the circle of Ben Zakkai in a new Yavneh. Many aspects of Jewish life as we know it are no longer feasible, and Jews survive only in isolated pockets, maybe in places like Nunavut. What elements of Judaism are most central and essential, and how would you preserve them? What will you establish as Jewish practice? Will it be the same as now? Will it be totally different? Will it be somewhere in between? You know, those are all open questions. So we're going to ask you to identify 1 to 3 elements of Judaism that you would want to preserve, reinvent, or create, and when we come back, be prepared to present to the group.
As Paul's breaking us out again, I would remind everyone this is something we're talking about several generations down the road, 250 years down the road. We're projecting ourselves into a far off future from our own lifetime's perspective.
And here we go.
Shabbat Shalom, yes.
So the question we're looking at is, what do we do now in order to prepare for an unknown future where the only thing we can predict is that it's not going to be as lush in terms of resources of all kinds as the present? Malachi is on his way back in, maybe.
Well, Oren came up with a plan of action.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a plan of action, but
I do.
Okay. Okay, so I mentioned that, you know, if we're going into more insular communities, I mentioned that, you know, I get my meat from Baltimore, and I'm sure that it did not originate in Baltimore. So my steaks go a long way, and then some. So, and I remembered that Reb Zalman once mentioned that he wanted all of his students to know at least how to shecht chickens, but nobody took him up on this idea, because, you know, we used to meat coming in little styrofoam boxes from Wegmans. It's not exactly it's very we do not think about the animals, and probably I would say that if we did, most of us would probably be vegetarians. And Andra mentioned that, you know, Muslims have a similar issue, because, you know, with halal slaughter being very similar to kosher slaughter. And I said, hey, maybe communities should start a local joint Muslim Jewish chicken farm or something like that. Maybe that could, you know, foster community relations and get us. Oh yeah, cold food is great. And get locally raised meat instead of ordering it from New York City or from Baltimore or from wherever you.
Yeah, one of our members raises cattle and has actually looked into whether he could obtain kosher slaughtering and butchering for, you know, one animal a year.
Mm-hmm. And it's tough.
Yes. Elliot mentions about, if not yet vegan, a company with totally grass-fed meat. You know, I remember a few years ago at a Hazon conference, there was a demonstration given by a shacht, that everybody should see how an animal is shechted. And they had some fascinating results. About half the people who were not vegetarian, after they'd seen the animal alive and then watched it be shechted, could not bear to eat it. But about half the vegetarians did, because they said the shachet's treatment of the animal resolved their doubts about the ethical status that regarding cruelty to animals. He was an exceptional shachet. And he said that he himself is vegetarian except for Shabbat and Yom Tov. And it seems to me that this might be something that should be new halacha. There's one of the resources we're going to give you a link to in a moment is a quiz that was in the New York Times. It's interactive. And something that comes up in it is that most people are willing to reduce the amount of packaging in the things they buy but you know, it's not up to the individual, but they would be happy with that. The thing is, it takes 11 years of minimal packaging to offset the amount of carbon from 1 year of eating meat. So eating vegan for 1 year accomplishes as much as minimizing packaging for 11 years.
I was inadvertently removed from Zoom entirely there as our session ended, just catching back up. And on that, I was going to add, as a person who kept livestock, and it was chickens for us, there's a mindset change when it goes from maintaining that chick and ensuring its life and health all the way to the point in which you kill it for food. And it's that kind of connection to where your food comes from, again, I think we can all agree has been lost in a great deal. I don't know that we should all go back to raising our own livestock, but it did set up and establish some rules for us that we didn't eat our friends, and that our chickens would not be prolonged as a meat enterprise, but for the things they could give us daily that didn't require their lives so immediately. And we produced a tremendous amount of eggs that we were able to help our neighbors along the road and some of our coworkers with their meeting their nutritional needs, mostly giving away our eggs and accepting donations for the chicken's college fund otherwise. But the discussion of new halachot reminded me of Alvin Toffler. He was a futurist. He wrote Future Shock, he wrote Shockwave, he wrote Technocracy. These are some of the titles Toffler gave us. He said the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write. The illiterate of the 21st century will be the people who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so we need to absorb, I think, a certain degree of what the tradition is, and there might be some things we need to unlearn before we can move ahead.
Our plan for this session would have moved on now to one more breakout where we would ask you to commit to personally taking one action for each of these 3 time frames. We're not going to have time to do that, but I'm going to get the slide up in just a moment so that you can see what they are.
Shall I make available the PowerPoint presentation to the entire group now, or would you rather your presentation be by request?
Okay, I've put up a link to a page of links and resources, and it is among them.
Okay. I'll make sure to drop that in one more time before we disappear then. Okay, so we're asking you to consider one action
that you can implement immediately to mitigate climate change. It can be a personal action. It could be something that you try to bring about. The second is an action that you can implement within your probable lifetime, but which you alone cannot take immediately. And then an action toward creating a new Judaism for a largely uncertain and unknown future. My take on number three, I was saying in the breakout group, is that it's utterly essential, and it would be important even if we didn't anticipate big changes. It's essential to work for a state in which Jews everywhere can study Torah together or independently and teach it to one another without being dependent on a rabbinical school in New York City or somewhere else.
The idea of an uncertain future, one strikes me as the part of the reason why I chose where I lived was that I wanted to be somewhere that was central to the places I was going to be running around to, including my shul. It's a little more than a mile. I can walk, and in the summer I often do. In the winter, a little less frequently. But the decision to try to put myself relatively close to work and the things I do outside of work, and to not downplay the importance of making choices like that. When we choose to relocate, even though it certainly cost me more, to understand that there are benefits that came with that cost that can't necessarily be monetized in such a way, even though we'd like to try.
Okay. One last thing, I want to mention a session that takes place yet today at 4 o'clock. It's about opening climate conversations in our Jewish communities. It's something that's come up in many sessions that I've attended this week, is that we're all concerned that our communities don't speak about, think about climate issues as much as we wish, but we're also often very uncertain about whether we can introduce the subject and how to introduce it. So I'm looking forward to this. This is the description. The link to sign up is at the bottom of the page. It's also on the links and resources page.
There, we've got that in the chat again for you all. It tends to scroll by awfully quickly for me in any of these sessions I'm in. In the future down the road, if there is something you wanted to reach out to us about, I believe we have some contact information as well. And I'm certainly amicable to taking questions or suggestions or anything out there that you find that you want to pass along. I wouldn't hesitate to be happy to open that email and see that you've had something to help us keep this conversation going.
Okay. The organizers of the Climate Festival want us to bring to your attention 3 locations on the internet that they are recommending. One of them, the second one, is for making a personal commitment to action. It's interactive, and it's really easy to do. I mean, the commitment is really easy to make on the site. Actually carrying through with it is not so easy in all likelihood, which is why, if you do this, Hazon will email you periodically for the next 6 weeks about how to carry it out and to encourage you to stick to the plan. Finally, we have 2 things. In the list of resources, we have the blog posts that were the beginning of this, my article about Jewish theology and climate change, and the New York Times quiz that I mentioned already. This is how to reach us.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you who organized this. It's wonderful to be there with folks from Elmira. I just want to say one thing, if I can. I'm involved with one of the groups organizing this conference. It's the Jewish Earth Alliance.
Mhm.
I don't know if you have a hub, if there's a hub in Elmira, but you can all come together. It's a way of lobbying your Congress and trying to make a difference on a national level. Really nice, and you learn a lot about what's going on. So.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much. It was very educational.
It was really nice to have you all come by, and wonderful that you're able to entertain all of this and do the breakouts and help us think about these things. Like I said, if something comes up you think it'd be good to share, drop a note.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat shalom.